Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our second Women in Dentistry Forum this evening. It's great to have you join us for this our second. This is our second year of doing this webinar to the profession. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm joined by a fabulous panel that are going to discuss our topic tonight, and I'll introduce them to you in just a moment. My name's Jo Macbeth. I've been with Portman for 2.5 years, and I have the privilege of leading our talent function here at Portman, which focuses on what it's like for people, colleagues and clinicians to join, to grow and develop their careers at Portman, very simply. So without further ado, let's get stuck into our subject for this evening. These forums have been very much inspired by our ambitions at Portman to really start to think about what it means to think about challenging diversity, creating more inclusive workplace and championing equality. And we were very much inspired this year by our International Women's Day that we celebrated last year at Portman across our practices and also in our port office in Cheltenham. And the topic for this year's International Women's Day was about breaking the bias. And so we really wanted to use that as a source of inspiration for bringing people from the profession together to talk about what that might mean in dentistry. But it's not just about gender diversity that we're focused on, although we did celebrate International Women's Day. We're about championing equality and inclusion for all people. Whilst our business is fueled and powered by 93% of women, this for us is also about, as I say, equality of all natures, whether that's race, sexuality, gender identity, or ability itself. So, you know, what we've noticed is that there are some topics and around this subject that we want to explore a little bit more at Portman, and I've invited some friends along today to do just that. So without further ado, I'll introduce you to the panel, and then we'll get started on our topic today, which is all about whether dentistry can ever really truly be bias-free. So let me start by introducing friends and colleagues. So I'll introduce you as I can see you on the screen, and I think we've got somebody who's dialed in on audio as well. So without further ado, let me welcome Julie Ross, our newly appointed Managing Director for the UK and Ireland. And also Sam Waley-Cohen is on the audio line. He's dialed in, I think, from somewhere on his travels in Europe. He's our founder and CEO. So welcome to you both. From our clinical side of our business, our clinical team, I'd like to welcome Asad Rahman, who's one of our regional clinical leads, and he's also practices in one of our practices up in Malton. From our operational side of our business, I'd like to welcome both Matt Normington and Emma Poole, who are two of our operations managers and look after different parts of the country. I'd also like to welcome Jack Curtis, who represents our practice management community. He's one of our assistant practice managers, but he's also a qualified dental nurse. And I'd also like to welcome some people from outside of Portman, bringing some of the outside-in thinking to our conversation today. So from within the profession, I'd like to welcome Dr. Sharon Kaur. Welcome, Sharon. Sharon is a speaker, thought leader, and writer on the subjects around bias, diversity, inclusion, sexism, gender identity. So welcome, Sharon. Sharon runs a practice up in Coventry, which is Dr. Sharon's facial aesthetics. So welcome, Sharon. And finally, but by no means least, I'm very pleased to welcome Laura Hong to the conversation this evening. Laura is actually from outside of the profession. Laura has has some years experience and lots of experience working as a management consultant with across many industries and with many leaders in diversity inclusion, and is now the group diversity inclusion manager at Tesco. So welcome to you all. So to get us started, before we start thinking about our panel discussion this evening, Julie, can I come to you and just ask you about why for you it was so important that Portman starts really having conversations about women in dentistry, and why we set up the forum, and why it's so important to you as well?
Thanks, Jo. So welcome everybody, and thank you very much for joining us. It's a real privilege to lead a business that is so much powered by women, and the dentistry industry as a whole is extremely reliant on women. And I think for that reason, it's really important that we do think about bias, that we do think about how we encourage equality, as Joe says, of all its forms, and we think really closely about what bias does exist in our industry and our profession and what we can do about it. You know, why is it that 96% of our dental nurses are women? What is the bias there that's preventing more men from applying to those roles? Why is it that it's a similar percentage of our receptionists are women, and what can we do about that? For me, it's really important as a female leader to champion these causes and to create conversation about it. There's so much work that's been done beyond dentistry, and I think we're exceptionally lucky to have Laura here with us tonight to bring some of that thinking in, and also to have Sharon bringing a perspective from outside of Portman. This is not a Portman conversation, this is a profession-wide conversation, and I'm delighted to be part of it. So thank you to everybody for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Julie, for that. And Sam, over to you. You know, the founder and CEO of Portman Dental. This is now our second webinar of this nature that we've done. We did one a year ago. Just want to ask you for your opening remarks, really, about why this is so important, and why starting these conversations is so important to us at Portman.
Well, thanks, Joe, and thanks for everyone dialing in. Thanks to panelists, and sorry, my camera's not working, so although perhaps you're happier not to see me. Look, Joe, I think one of the interesting and amazing things about dentistry is that we're so in the community. So we are a community business. We're a business that look after people, and we challenge ourselves to treat people as we'd want to be treated. And I think at its most basic level, that extends to not think about us as individuals, but how we think about us in a much broader context of whatever our sex, background, and diversity in all dimensions. So it just feels to all of us that as a community business, we need to behave in the way that we'd want to be treated, and making sure that we think about women in our community and in our practices and in the wider profession is a central part to treating people as we'd want to be treated. So delighted to be on this panel tonight.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sam. And we know, don't we, that individuality and respecting individuality is such a big part of what makes Portman Portman. And I think that very much links to your piece there about, we also very much talk about very regularly about treating people as we'd wish to be treated. And I think these are key parts of what makes Portman Portman. But I also recognise, and having joined the profession 2.5 years ago, I'm from outside of the profession before that, and it's such a great privilege to be part of this profession. I work with clinicians every single day. I talk to clinicians every single day, and I get the great pleasure of talking to many of our practice colleagues. But I do, and so I'm ever inspired by their passion for patients, for their profession, for their for what we're trying to do at Portman, and in the wider profession as well, talking to people in the wider profession. But I do think that there are examples of things where we perhaps would, if we hold the mirror up to ourselves and say, actually, maybe we do have some things that we need to start drawing more attention to. Maybe we do need to create more awareness about things, the language we use, the way that people see each other in practice, the way people work with each other across Portman, the representation that we have. And I know, Sharon, you've written a lot about representation and underrepresentation, and some of those examples where perhaps there's still some fairly what might be seen as traditional views about women in leadership positions and clinical leadership positions in practice. And I've certainly come across some of these things. So I welcome this opportunity tonight to hear from all of you about your experiences. And also I welcome the opportunities to hear questions and comments from our audience this evening. So if you do have a question for the panel, as the evening goes on, and we'll be around until 8 o'clock this evening, please do drop it in the questions or chat box. We've got Andy waiting in the background to take your questions and share those with us a little bit later on. So please do post your questions to us, and we want to hear from you as well. So Matt, perhaps I can come to you now. You know, you're working as one of our operations managers across a couple of our regions, actually. Why for you is this such an important topic, and why do you think it's important that dentistry and particularly Portman have this conversation?
Thanks, Joe, and hi everybody. So I guess the main reason that we should really be addressing the bias, and first of all, our aspiration must be a resounding yes, that we can bring about a bias-free dental industry. A dental practice, or any workplace for that matter, that is free from bias is one that will have a happy and engaged workforce, where everyone that comes to work there, they feel valued and respected. And at the end of the day, that is probably going to be great for us in the long run, where people are not subjected to sort of casual or lazy discriminatory remarks. But we can still acknowledge that there is a significant gender imbalance within most dental practice populations at the moment. But we need to work hard to ensure that all of our colleagues and our clinicians and even our applicants have equal opportunity to learn and develop and be given the opportunity to work for us. By being known to be free from bias, we encourage more people, more great people, to join our organisation, and we can unlock more talent from within by ensuring that everyone has the same opportunity. As I said on the video that I did before, truly breaking the bias is when gender or any protected category ceases to be any issue at all in anything. So for me, that's kind of a summary. That's what this is all about.
Yeah, thanks for that, Matt. And perhaps Sharon, I can bring you in here if that's okay, and just to kick us off with some of that sort of broader insight from yourself in terms of the profession and why you think it's so important that we have conversations about bias.
So I think, good evening, everybody. I think Matt's really hit the nail on the head there. You know, making people feel valued and included is really essential for any organisation to maximise staff satisfaction, staff retention and productivity of that organisation. So I'm a dental practice owner, so I employ staff, and I graduated way back in 2008. Now I've seen huge changes since when I graduated. I bought my practice in 2011, and from then to now, again, I've just seen so much. I've employed so many staff. I've seen the staff turnover, and I've just seen the real differences. Now, ultimately, we have to understand that bias is ingrained within us. It's an unconscious thing. It's in that part of our brain called the limbic system, which is processing stimuli all the time. Any social interactions, any cognitive kind of experiences we have, it's happening without us knowing. The only way we're ever kind of going to overcome any bias is by acknowledging it. So some people don't even know they have it, or they're acting on it. When Matt said, you know, like comments that can be made or discriminatory remarks, you know, that aligns itself with microaggressions that can be occurring in a work environment that you might be contributing to and you're just not aware of it. So I think acknowledging bias and understanding it is really key. And the only way to really do that is by improving your social ethical competence, so having a diverse workforce. And that's going to not be done overnight. It's going to take time, but it has to be done if we are to create these safe work environments where we attract, like you said, Matt, a lot of talent that is out there in order to maximize our productivity as a business. But that's not the sole purpose. It's to create a work environment where people feel valued. So, you know, like biases can just, there's such a huge spectrum, isn't there? Essentially, if you look at the Equality Act, the characteristics that are in that, the protected characteristics, essentially those are what's present now, but this whole thing is constantly evolving, and we don't know in 5 years time there might be another protected characteristic that you and I haven't even thought of. So it's one of those things that's constantly evolving, and we need to move with the time, but understanding what's going on, learning from other people's social interactions, learning from, you know, huge movements like BLM, Me Too movements, things like that, personally.
And Dr.
I don't
Sharon,
know if that answered your question, actually.
That's great. I'm interested to know your thoughts about, particularly about the profession. And you talk to many people in the profession all the time. You were speaking at an event only a couple of weeks ago on related topics. What's your sense of you know, what people are experiencing in the profession and in our practices every day.
So I can give you an example. I don't employ a hygienist, and I don't have many hygienist friends. Most of my cohort of friends is basically dentists. And at the talk at the BDAI showcase, I actually spoke to dental hygienists, which were really upset with the profession, and I was totally unaware. So hygienists at the moment, after this whole COVID and like working without a nurse, I don't know if that was a big thing, because like I said, I have limited experience with dental hygienists, so I wasn't even aware that this was even an issue. But hygienists don't seem to be very happy at the moment. Hygienists and therapists, generally they seem to be working alone, apparently, without chaperones, and that's generally accepted. And if I had not spoken, had that conversation not taken place, I would have just, I would not even have known. Now that conversation has taken place, it's been acknowledged, I've highlighted it to you. This is on a public arena. Now, do you see how that effect, the snowball effect's taking place? So essentially, that's a big thing that's not, people aren't happy with. There was, I know that a lot of dental associates were generally not happy with, payments and things like that. So again, there was probably some bias if people were pregnant. I don't know, pregnant associates, there was a big, a lot of people were dissatisfied with their principals. So I'm not a huge practice, so it's a 3 surgery practice, and I'm not, like in a position with like you guys where you're running the corporate, so you probably have a vast number of dentists, employed or self-employed, but so you're going to experience that a lot more. What I was hearing at the showcase was that generally the profession is unhappy as a whole, and dental hygienists and therapists in particular are not being valued, and hence looking for alternative careers, which may predict in a few years' time we might have a gap. There will be a shortage of dental hygienists and therapists. So these people need to be listened to. But as a dentistry, look at the example just now. Only today that letter came out about the target. So can you see how dentistry as a whole is just not really acknowledged or respected? So it's quite a demotivating profession to be in if you are working in the NHS at the moment.
And you talked in some of the pieces you've written online about underrepresentation in dentistry and how that stems back to not just about practice life, but much further down, if you like, the kind of value chain, if you like, kind of who's going to who are people's role models, who are young people looking at and saying, I want that sort of career. Do they feel like they're able to enter the profession? Do they feel like they're able to enter the qualifications? And do they feel like they represent and can be represented in practices? You've written quite a bit about that. Do you want to just tell us a little bit more about underrepresentation as well?
Well, I'll just give you a really recent example of that. At the showcase, I was approached by a sixth form student, a black sixth form student, who came up to me and goes, I really want to do dentistry, but do you think there's any point me applying? I said, oh, why would you say that? Like, if you really want to do it, you should definitely go for it. She goes, but you just never see any black dentists. I was just like, oh my gosh, my friend, one of my best friends is black, but she was absolutely right. Generally, you don't really see many dentists from Afro-Caribbean backgrounds. So already she had not seen a role model, thought, shall I bother? Shall I not? Or here's a female who is, essentially not white. Maybe I can approach her and speak to her about that. So that was like another stark realization of, oh my gosh, yeah, dentistry is still so underrepresented by so many ethnic groups. But if I look back at my dental school, so when I went to Birmingham Dental School, and all the clinicians, majority of them were middle-class white males. Now, dental school, the clinicians are really varied, actually. There's a lot of diverse, clinicians from different ethnic minorities. So it's changing. I don't know how quickly it's changing and how it needs, in which direction. We obviously need to keep changing, but there has been progress. Now, one other example, when we look at gender, dental schools are predominantly female. There's a lot of females in dental schools now, but when one of my really good friends, he's a dental hygienist and therapist. Literally, there's hardly any male dental hygienists and therapists. He felt when he went to university, he went to Newcastle, and he helped me write the piece on LGBT because I had actually very little experience with that, because how can I experience bias and discrimination if I'm not from that community? Just like, how would you experience racism from a white middle class male when you're white, Joe? So we need to understand. And when I spoke to him and researched the whole area, I saw from a completely different insight, and that increased my awareness and understanding.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
it really, that's where having a diverse workforce, having people from different backgrounds, brings their experiences, their skill set, their talent, allowing for that work environment to be reflective of what's the community it's serving. Do you see? And I wouldn't have even known if I had never had that conversation. And that's why it's so important.
Thank you, Sharon. And Laura, I know we spoke earlier, and hopefully we'll get the opportunity to hear about how walking in other people's shoes and hearing from other people is so important in how to help break down some of this bias. So let's come on to talk about that. But speaking of men in our profession, Sharon, I'd like to bring in Jack, if I may. So Jack, tell us a little bit about what you do, and also, but specifically about how you see, what are your thoughts on bias in dentistry, and what have you experienced yourself, or perhaps you've seen from friends and colleagues within the profession?
Yeah, so I was at previous to Portman working as a locum dental nurse. 9 times out of 10 I'd step foot in a practice and people would be shocked that there was a male nurse, or sometimes even at the end of the shift they'll go, I'm actually really surprised you're actually really good at your job. Things like that. Previous to that, I've worked with foundation dentists, and some people asking female dentists, are you able to take a tooth out as a female? Are you strong enough to take a tooth out as a female? Which gobsmacked me, because what is the difference? Like, how can you say you're capable of taking a tooth out when you've all had the same education? And then, well, like, yeah, most of the time it was always, I've never worked with a male nurse, I never even come across a male nurse working through the 5 years I've worked, never come across a male nurse yet. Yeah, definitely something to think about.
And those experiences you've just recounted there, Jack, that sounds like that's from both colleagues and patients, by the sounds of it.
Yeah.
Some reactions. Yeah,
definitely. I definitely had a lot of clinicians kind of really confused, like, who's this person stood in my surgery? Yeah, and then always at the end, I was like, I'm really shocked at how good you are, or I'm really shocked that you're good at nursing. Again, I don't understand the difference there. And then from the patients side, I've also had a lot of patients ring up and request, can I see an English dentist? Can I see a female dentist or a male dentist, really specific in who they want to see and who they want to be treated by? So yeah, seen quite a lot of mixed from a lot of different angles.
And what have you noticed about what can really so you get asked these questions by the sounds of it. What are your reactions to that, and what have colleagues around you that have perhaps noticed that as well, been privy to that experience? What have people's reactions been?
A lot of kind of practice managers that I've been working with a long time, they've been really shocked, and they always kind of say, well, that isn't even a comment that you need to make. Like, Jack's gender has nothing to do with his ability of his job, or what he's doing, or why he's doing his job. Like, just see Jack as a dental nurse, not as a male or as a female. Yeah, it was a challenge at one point. I remember I was like, have I made the right decision? Kind of this position. Getting that question every day, I was like, oh God, am I doing something wrong? Like, should I actually be in this job?
And have you seen that change, or would you say you still get that? I don't know how long you've been nursing for, but do you?
So, I've been nursing since about, I want to say 2015, and I haven't really seen a change, if I'm honest. I still think people are really shocked if I go into a surgery now. Especially I noticed it when I was a locum, kind of going from a different place every single day.
Yeah,
so
I
was constantly having to have them conversations with people and explaining, I've been doing my job for this many years, I've been qualified for this long, I've done this post-qualification, and there's a lot of explaining. And kind of
well, I'm glad you got in it, Jack, and you've gone on to become one of our assistant practice managers as well. So love to hear a little bit more later about what you think we can do to help more people like you. We want great people for great jobs, and to use people's talents, and for me, you know, this also underpins how we need to communicate so much better and on an ongoing basis with our patients, because we need to be representative of who we're treating, and connecting with them and being part of those communities. So love to discuss that a little bit more with you as well. So perhaps I'll come to Asad now. Good evening, Asad. How are you doing? I'd love to hear your experiences about this in dentistry. So that may or may not be while you've been with Portman, but I'd love to just hear your opening thoughts about this topic.
Yes, I mean, thank you for having me on tonight. I mean, it's when people look at dentistry in general, they kind of see the wider facts. So they see a profession where, you know, 47% of dentists are female. You see 49% of GDC registrants are from a Black, Asian, minority ethnic background. But when you start to dig a bit deeper, you start to find obviously bias towards certain groups of people. And so one of the statistics the GDC releases every year on dentist pay, for example, found that female dentists, even when they work in the same practice, they earn on average about £10,000 less a year than male dentists. Now, there's not been any work done on why that is, but that's one of the statistics that's out there. And then when you look at in terms of race, even though I mentioned 49% of dentists are from a Black, Asian, minority ethnic background, and Dr. Sharon touched on this earlier, when we look at that breakdown, only less than 1% of GDC registrants identify as Black. So a massive bias towards certain groups of people. And we had that discussion about earlier, obviously, about hospital dentistry, academic dentistry, and tutors, etc. And if you look at the dental schools in the UK, and if we look at the 18 dental schools that either teach undergraduate or postgraduate dentistry, only 4 of the deans of the dental school are women, and none of the 18 deans are from a Black, Asian, minority ethnic background. So again, you can see, whereas in the profession, we've got 49% of GDC registrants that are from Black, Asian, minority ethnic background, and then you look at hospital deans, etc., people in positions of powers, there's none there. So you see a big disparity, and that's why I feel it's important to obviously speak about this topic and bring about a change, because without that, we're not going to move forwards, obviously.
What's your experience been like at Portman, Asad, and how's Portman supported you?
So, I mean, one of the things, like I mentioned, the gender pay gap. So, as Julie and Sam will know, Matt and Emma being our operations managers, the practices I look after are predominantly the NHS practices. And one of the first things we look to do there is look at the pay of individuals. So dentists' UDA rate, we try and get on the same level. And practice colleagues, we try and get their pay the same as well, because we don't want any disparity there. So, I mean, that's one of the things I feel obviously proud working with Portman about, and I feel as an industry, for example, the UDA rate for dentists, that can be quite easily corrected. Practices can look at their UDA rates and put people on the same UDA rate, so there's no pay gap there. I think, like I said, when we look at dentistry and we just look at general practice, it's easy for people to say there's not much bias, but then when we look at the wider industry in terms of hospital and academic dentistry, then that's when we start to see biases. So again, if we look at the example that Dr. Sharon was giving about the student that approached her, I mean, the statistics there are so stark. So a prospective student from a white background applying to dental school has a 54% chance of acceptance. A student from an Asian minority ethnic background has a 41% chance, but a black prospective student has just a 19% acceptance rate into dental school. So it really, if there's any bias to a certain group of people, it begins very early on in the profession, from even acceptance into dental school and universities.
Which might explain why that young student approached Dr. Sharon and had that conversation. I mean, perhaps they had read those statistics or heard about it from colleagues and friends and family members about what the perceived realities are, or the realities are, in terms of making your way into the profession. So yeah, that's absolutely it, isn't it? It's kind of like, this isn't just about our practices and where we are as a business, or where Dr. Sharon is with her practice. It's much more systemic than that. And I think that's what you're talking about there, Asad. Let's come to Emma in terms of from an operational point of view. So Emma, hi, good evening. Tell us a little bit about your experience and your perspectives on the profession when it comes to bias.
I think as operations manager, and as well in my career, I'm really going to echo what Jack said, and Julie kind of mentioned briefly earlier on about that real misconception that dental nurses and receptionists should predominantly always be a female. And I've worked with both male practice managers, male receptionists, and male dental nurses in my career, and I have to say they were amazing. But there would be examples, for example, where a patient would come into the surgery, they would presume that the nurse was the dentist because he was male. If the dentist was female, for example, they would automatically gravitate towards the female dentist because they thought she was the nurse. So it's kind of really trying to, for me, it's something I'm really passionate about. I'm really trying to change that mindset and see what we can do as a business and, you know, as a whole, really, to kind of change that mindset. And I do think it really is, it is something we can help, but obviously it's going to take time, isn't it? It's not something we can do overnight. And it's unconscious bias, definitely.
And you talked to us over the last few weeks, Emma, about the sorts of things you're trying to do within your teams, such as look at language. I remember you talking to us about that. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I really encourage open conversations as well. And we constantly talk about things like this in our meetings and our calls, really making awareness and also taking people on their merits as well, not on their gender or sexuality, etc., etc. So it's really about being really open and trying to break that gender stereotype, really, for us. We've also recently been sending nurses out to schools and colleges, really trying to educate on dental nursing. One, it helps us recruit anyway, but also really trying to reach out to males as well to kind of say, this is a career for everybody, not just for females, you know? So yeah, I'm really excited about what we can do to help that going forward, definitely.
Thanks, Emma. And Matt, I know we've talked about experiences that you've noticed when you've gone out to practice along similar lines, really, as to what Emma was talking about there, where people assume, because of their bias, or perhaps unconscious bias, they assume people are in certain roles. And you've certainly had an experience of that, I think.
Absolutely right. Yes. So I'm very proud to work for a fantastic female head of operations who's a brilliant leader, who has worked her way up through from dental nurse, practice manager, operations manager, head of operations, and really, you know, got there on merit and experience. And I remember very early on when I first joined Portman, I went out for a day out with her, and I was new to dentistry at the time. I had very little knowledge of dentistry at all at the time. It was brand new to me. And we met a dentist for the first time in one of the practices that I'd taken over responsibility for. So that dentist had never met me and never met my line manager. That dentist just wanted to engage with me directly for the entire conversation and pretty much ignored my head of operations line manager. and just assumed that I was the more senior colleague based on my gender. That's the only assumption I can make, really. I just had to deal with it by making sure introductions were made and facilitated the conversation to include all parties. But that was just very much a really good example of an unconscious bias I felt was plain to see, really.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit more about some of your experiences then, Matt, and why this subject's so important for you.
Well, for me, I kind of align myself to a charity outside of work which focuses on issues that men face in the wider world as well, but I very much recognise that the International Women's Day is about promoting equality for all, so I'm definitely a champion for it. And I've seen and been subject to and witnessed sort of jokey, light-hearted, but ultimately demeaning comments in practice on Teams meetings. And it's just immensely frustrating, really, to see it still going on. So it's really refreshing that we feel encouraged at Portman and empowered to call it out at the time that we see it.
Thank you, Matt. And last but not least, I'd like to bring Laura into the conversation now. Good evening, Laura. How are you doing? Thank you for joining us. You've been working in the diversity and inclusion space for a little while now, and I'm just keen to get your thoughts on how things are changing, what you're noticing, and some of the ways that we might start to learn from other industries about raising more awareness around bias in particular.
Yeah, no worries. Yes, so hi everyone. Lovely to join you this evening. Yeah, so I think as you mentioned, I've been working in D&I kind of nearly coming to about 10 years now. So it's definitely a changing landscape, and I think with everything that's going on externally around D&I, especially in the last few years, it's definitely got more of a presence on a kind of senior leadership agenda, which is brilliant in terms of kind of what I do and what I'm seeing organisations doing. I think there's kind of an evolution in terms of awareness of understanding what unconscious bias is, in terms of kind of what you might think of more kind of a tick box exercise and kind of sheep tiptoeing, or this is it, this is the theory of it, and then wrapping it up into more of a how do we look not just at individuals' unconscious biases, but obviously mitigating that, but how it's wrapped up in terms of the processes and the policies that occur within an organisation. Because I think what is important to differentiate, and I know this has already been alluded to slightly, but is the difference, I guess, between unconscious bias on an individual basis, which is very much kind of hardwired into us as humans, and it's shaped by all the kind of experiences that we have, and knowing that, and then what I would kind of refer to more as like hidden bias, which is more of a systemic problem in policies and processes. So it's how does an organisation think holistically across all of that, of what throughout the colleague life cycle, where are the points where bias can be most prevalent, and what do we need to do at those areas? So whether that's looking at kind of blind CVs or hiring practices or training of hiring managers, right through to kind of progression and looking at your succession planning through a D&I lens, like what can we do across all of those points? And I think an area that I'm always kind of harping on about in my team is around data particularly. And I think organizations as well, what I'm saying is they are getting better at the importance of collecting diversity data, because we can talk about having bias and where we think there is underrepresentation or not. And the story about kind of the candidate coming in at a kind of grad level, I think really speaks around that of what we're hearing. But until we have the data of this is where the drop off occurs at different levels within a business, that will really help us identify this is where the challenge is, and this is how we put in place the most successful intervention. Because I know from working with lots of organisations, sometimes we'll just kind of fire off ways that we think will solve this without kind of the data to back up, and actually they end up spending loads of money on things that aren't the most successful further down the line. So I think there's kind of a changing scene, I guess, with regards to unconscious bias, and how do we position that more as being consciously inclusive in everything that we do from the point of view of a colleague.
Yeah, I really like that idea of consciously inclusive. Tell us a little bit more about that, Laura.
Yes, I think it's that switch from just being aware of what your bias is to actually thinking about kind of what are the thoughts and the beliefs and the behaviors that will allow us to make better results, to get better results, and kind of not allow that to play out. So to actively kind of seek out difference rather than just accepting it. So again, kind of coming into the representation point and having diversity in a group. It's great if we accept that. We don't want to just accept it, we want to appreciate it. We want to get people in there who have that diverse kind of backgrounds to our own, and they bring something different to the table. And you know, I'm sure you've seen all the research around better teams or you know, more diverse teams are better teams and more productive teams and all of that kind of thing. So it's looking at it through all those different stages, I guess. And I think a part of that, and probably the most uncomfortable part, is calling it out in others as well as ourselves. So how do we not just think about our own biases and what we're doing to reduce those where possible, but how do we challenge colleagues and say when, okay, microaggressions are taking place or something's been said? And I think from what I heard, you know, Jack mentioned there as well, is how do you be really brave in terms of what you're hearing from customers at times or clients, kind of the presumptions that are made of colleagues within the practice, and what does Portman stand for in terms of this is what's acceptable, and almost see itself as kind of how do we educate not only our colleagues but our customers about our stance on what it means to be a dentist or a dental nurse, you know, within that framework. So yeah, it's kind of the wider piece, I guess.
Yeah, really interesting, really interesting. And you and I talked about, you've run programs that have looked at how do you understand the data from an organization of 100,000 people where you perhaps didn't even have email addresses for them. How did you go about, you know, understanding those experiences, the people, and where those perhaps drop-off points are? How did you go about that?
So we're very much kind of, I guess, still work in progress at Tesco, but it was a program that we launched coming up to about 18 months ago now, a campaign just to learn more about the diversity of our colleagues. So yeah, we have kind of come up to 400,000 colleagues, and the majority of them are in our stores and distribution centres. So they're not sat at a desk and easily able to click on an email and give us their data, and maybe not as much engaged about why and what we're going to do with that data. So yeah, we went out with a whole campaign called This Is Me, about the importance of capturing the data and ultimately what we are hoping to do with that. And that's obviously the kind of regulatory, you know, gender pay gap reporting, and hopefully going down ethnicity pay gap and other demographics around with that, and all the kind of external submissions and things that we do. But ultimately, how can giving your data enable us to have more awareness of where there are challenges within the business? So thinking about, are we seeing underrepresentation in certain areas where we need to put in place, say, talent communities? And that's something that was recently kind of launched at Tesco last year around talent communities for our ethnically diverse colleagues. And not to say that that is based on the kind of solving problems for them in terms of, I think it has to be an organisational approach, that you're not fixing the person, you're shaping the organisation, so you don't want it to be that. But how can we look at what the development needs of those individuals are that can then help us to make it a better place for them to get on? So the data is still kind of coming through, and we're looking at all different ways about how do we engage with colleagues in our stores. So different kind of yeah, posters and team talks and QR codes and things like that, because they don't just all have a Tesco email address, unfortunately, so it's not as easy. So it's all kind of word of mouth and sharing colleague stories, we found, is a really important one. So we have kind of active colleague networks across a number of demographics, but how can we use those to share the stories of people who've been able to get on, who maybe people don't always look up and see someone who looks like that within the business, but how, if we have that role model, we're using them effectively to talk about, I guess, you know, making it a more inclusive environment for everyone. But I think a lot of organisations have a challenge with diversity data. I think you're always going to come up against a lot of people who prefer not to say, but I think that in itself gives you a lot of information about the culture of an organisation, and just tracking a prefer not to say rate over a number of years will tell you about how some of the D&I initiatives are actually changing that. So yeah, work in progress, but we'll see.
And one last question for you, Laura. Tell us a little bit about how you've tried to challenge people's bias by enabling them to walk in other people's shoes. Tell us a little bit about that. I know you've done some work.
Yeah. So Tesco have recently rolled out, we call it Be an Inclusive Manager training for all our managers. But what we've also done at more of the leadership levels is to kind of wrap up training as more alongside kind of, you know, awareness and what is unconscious bias and the theory of inclusion. I guess more experiential kind of training as well. So it's been partnered with a mentoring experience for our senior leaders, which we delivered with an organisation called the Rival Education, which is a specialist company that matches senior leaders with kind of young people. I think they're about 18 to 24 years old, from socially economic backgrounds to our own, and who are ethnic minorities. And they have been paired with our senior leaders from CEO and kind of C-suite and +1, just to really understand like what are the challenges for those individuals, and for our execs who understand a bit more about what it's like to be in their shoes and some of the challenges, and also what more Tesco can do for colleagues who also share those characteristics, rather than us trying to put in place things that we think are the right thing. Let's actually talk to individuals who have grown up in those circumstances, or who've grown up with those prejudices and things like that, so that we can make it better for people coming into Tesco in the future, but also our current colleagues who sit in those demographics. So we do that, and we also have done something which I took part in, which I think has had the most kind of memorable, I guess, experience for me in D&I training, which was called the Human Library, which is where, again, an external organisation which has a number of people on its books who are books in the Human Library. So hopefully this makes sense. But you have a training, and you go into a virtual room with a book, who is a person who basically is there for you to read, to give you the opportunity to speak to someone who you may have never considered within your friendship group, or you might have never kind of spoken to before. So it'll be people who are transgender, who've got chronic illnesses, who are severely disabled, anything across a broad spectrum. But just to understand, I guess, initially, how your own biases can play out when you first go into that room. And obviously I've worked in D&I for a long time, and I like to think that I'm keeping those things in check, but I know myself, I went into a room and the person or the book came on the screen, and I automatically thought I knew what we were going to be talking about, and it wasn't that. And I thought to myself afterwards, like, oh my goodness, you have completely jumped into what you think. Just, you know, that was your own bias there, you read into it. But to have that opportunity to speak to her really, really openly about some of the challenges she'd had was just so kind of thought-provoking, really. So I would definitely recommend kind of that kind of, I guess, wrapping that all together to, yes, you have the theory, but then you've just putting yourself in someone else's shoes, which I think is quite difficult to do if it's just kind of an e-learning or a classroom-based one-day training. So how do you find those kind of experiences to really make a mark and get people to come away from that kind of training with, okay, this is a clear action plan for something to do. It's not just we're going to talk about it and then we're going to kind of forget about it tomorrow and we're going to move on. How do we actually embed that in how we work going forwards, and how do we continue to come back to that and hold ourselves accountable for what we learned during those sessions? So yeah,
that's fantastic. Some great examples there, and lots that we can learn from as well. Time is rapidly passing by, so I'm going to turn now to some questions that we've had from some of our audience. This first one perhaps builds on some of the things that Laura was talking about, but perhaps it's got a broader nature to it. So one of the first questions we've had is as follows. Some people, regardless of their industry or workplace, may not feel confident enough to speak up about an experience of bias they've witnessed or been through themselves. What can Portman do to create a safe space, so to speak, to ensure that everyone and anyone can raise as necessary? So I'm going to come to, who shall I come to first? I'm going to come to Dr. Sharon, I think. She's nodding.
Well, you know, basically it's like Laura had mentioned, it's about the organization, isn't it? It's not just the individuals. It's if the ethos of the organization is quite clear and you have clear values, then that will slowly filter down, won't it, to all the different employees. And leadership is really important. So I mean, at my practice, I consciously sit, I will make time to sit with my staff, not every lunchtime, because sometimes that doesn't happen just because there's so many other commitments, but I will go and sit with my staff, and by listening to them at lunchtime and listening to what they're saying, you can get a feel for what's going on, like the dynamics. And sometimes some people won't always be chatty, and you can get a feel. Your gut instinct is, pretty important, and you can get a general impression of what's going on, if someone's looking happy or not looking happy. And I think regular one-to-ones, and and you don't even have to call it a one-to-one or an appraisal, but chatting to all your members of staff, just touching base, are you okay, is everything okay, is really, really important. That communication, and it's not always done. It has to be really quite a verbal, face-to-face thing, because emails are hard to do sometimes, and not everyone would like to communicate via an email. But essentially, if you are in a position where you feel like you have been treated or spoken to or made to feel devalued, or you feel like something has been done that's threatened your safety, your well-being, it's made you upset, you're simply just not happy with that, then I think you should document those items. Now, you might not always, it varies from people's personalities, isn't it? Some people are very forward and they would just say, oh, I don't really like that comment, say it there and then. And some would just be like, ugh, I didn't really like that comment, and then just pretend it didn't happen. And then some would go away for many days and reflect and go, I didn't really like that comment. So there's lots of ways to process that kind of interaction. So I think writing down and getting contemporaneous dates and times and logs of what's happened is really key, number one. But I assume, like a big organization like Portman, I mean, we have it as well. We have our HR department. So, if someone was unhappy, and I make it really well known at my practice, if you're ever unhappy, we've got an open door policy, come and talk to me. But if you don't want to talk to me because maybe it was me that made you unhappy, then these are all the different channels. So you have to have more than one channel. And it can't always be that same person that they have to approach. So there are ways and means. Now, if you're a dental professional, you'll also be, you should have dental indemnity. So you can always seek advice from your dental indemnity and basically ask them, just say, this is what's happened and I just want some advice, because the more people you talk about, the more understanding you'll get of how to handle that situation. So I think that's really key. But by writing things down sometimes adds clarity, because sometimes you don't really know what it was that upset you. And it may well have just been the tone of how something was said.
Thanks, Dr. Sharon. Emma, coming back to you, you sound like in your team you're endeavouring to create those safe spaces for people to be able to have conversations.
Always, and it's really important for me. I have one-to-ones with all of my team, despite not having much time to do that, but I make sure I always check up on them. And even if that's a message or a phone call or an email, and I'm very I'm really conscious of how they are on calls as well. And if there's anybody that's particularly quiet or doesn't see themselves, I always phone them and make sure everything's okay. But it's just ensuring that they speak up about any biases, etc., and really being open and honest and really encouraging that open conversation. For me, it's really important.
Perhaps Julie, thanks Emma. Perhaps Julie, I can come to you for another question. This is about being leaders in the industry. So here's a question from one of our audience members tonight. So please can we ask the panel to outline their key thoughts on the steps needed for Portman to become leaders in the industry, known for efforts creating a bias-free culture. It's a valuable part of your brand that we perhaps don't make a conscious effort to include always in some of the things that we talk about in terms of Portman. So how can we really become known as leaders in the industry for this?
It's a great question, and it's something that we're actively discussing as a leadership team. It is interesting when I attend the ADG, so the group of practice leaders from the corporate dental sector. There's usually about 40 people around that table, and there's usually 3 or 4 women. So there is senior leaderships in dentistry. There is a real imbalance, and there's definitely an ethnic imbalance there as well. So there is a lot to do in Portman and also outside of Portman. I think where we are at the moment, we're doing a lot of work in Portman about trying to walk in our colleagues' shoes. So we've got a number of colleague forums where we're starting to bring our practice managers, our nurses, and soon our receptionist voices in, so that we have groups of people that are telling us what it feels like to be a hygienist, a receptionist, a nurse, what's going well, what's not going well, and we work hard to try and encourage a mix of genders, ethnicity, background in those forums. We have to kind of encourage people to apply sometimes so that we make sure we get that equal voice. At a senior leadership level, we're very conscious when we're hiring to really push recruiters to make sure that we've got balanced long lists and short lists, which they don't always want to do, but that's something that we feel helps us get better candidates, because more diversity means that you're not just fishing in this tiny pool of the population. And I think we do really encourage everyone to make sure, as Emma said, regular one-to-ones are happening, but we do also have an anonymous line called Ask Sam, but basically people can email that and tell us anything that's happened. And I think Sharon makes a really important point. I call out bias when I see it, and I'm fairly strong and confident, and it's hard, and you feel like you're putting your head above the parapet all the time, and it is hard. And so I think it's really important that we recognise not everybody feels comfortable doing that, and particularly if there's a power imbalance in the relationship, people don't feel comfortable doing it. And I think we have to find ways to change that. We often have people who won't write down what's happened, they'll tell us, but they feel something's going to happen to them if they write it down, particularly if it's a nurse dentist or receptionist dentist type relationship. So I think in Portman we've got a lot to do to break the stereotypes of power in the dental industry and the profession, which we're really focused on. So we've done lots. We've got an awful lot more to do, and I think it's really exciting, and I think our colleagues and our clinicians are excited about it as well. So lots to do.
Thanks, Julie. I'm conscious that we've come to the end of our webinar time this evening, and wanting to be respectful of my fellow panelists and the audience, your time at home as an audience. So I'd like to say a big thank you to our panelists this evening. I think there's so much richness in this conversation. We could probably have talked for the rest of the evening about it, and really got into some of the other things that we could do to start proactively challenging some of the bias that we see around us, whether that's in or outside of dentistry as a profession. We know it exists, as Sharon says, we've all got unconscious bias, and I love this idea, Laura, of conscious inclusion as well. So really love to explore that some more. Clearly, we've got a long way to go. Clearly, as a profession, this is a conversation that we need to continue. So I hope that to come back and talk more about what we're doing as a profession, but also what we're doing at Portman, and working with you all and hearing from all of you that are on the panel this evening to help us shape that at Portman. So whether you're in or out of the profession, or in the profession, but in the wider community, as Dr. Sharon is. So thank you very much. Thank you for joining us this evening, and have a nice rest of the evening. Thanks then. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.